I'm the executive director of the Harvard Law School Library. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Silence your phones, not quite a movie theater, but if you could do that, I'd appreciate it. I want to take a minute to thank KB Beck, who's over here in the corner, who's the curator of the library's exhibit, Visualizing Capital Punishment, Spectacle, Shame, and Sympathy, which is on view in the library's Casperson room through summer 2023, and I invite you to come and visit that. We also have an online companion to that exhibit, which you can visit. A work by one of tonight's speakers, artist Antonio Martorell, is featured predominantly in the exhibit, and the library recently acquired 4 photographs by another one of our speakers, Lou Jones, which are also on view in the Casperson room. Okay, so this afternoon's conversation, Scholars and Artists Discuss the Death Penalty, is moderated by HLS professor Martha Minow. Martha is the 300th anniversary university professor here at the law school, where she's taught since 1981. She's an expert in human rights and advocacy for members of racial and religious minorities and for women, children, and persons with disabilities. She also writes and teaches about digital communications, democracy, privatization, military justice, and ethnic and religious conflict. An accomplished scholar, Professor Minow is a founder of the American Journal of Law and Equality and the author of the thought-provoking, and I think relevant to our exhibit this year, book, When Should Law Forgive? So I'm going to turn it over to Professor Minow, who will introduce our panelists and begin the conversation. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Jocelyn, and thank you, Jocelyn and KB, the whole team, for making this possible. And indeed, this whole year of really looking at capital punishment through many lenses, and I think the artistic one is absolutely vital. I am so honored to be here with some really outstanding leaders and experts. Professor John Bessler teaches capital punishment seminars, both at University of Baltimore School of Law and at the Georgetown University Law Center, after teaching in a lot of places. And among his many books, he has written The Death Penalty's Denial of Fundamental Human Rights, International Law, State Practice, and Emerging Abolitionist Norm, Cruel and Unusual, The American Death Penalty and the Founders' Eighth Amendment, and The Birth of American Law, an Italian philosopher and the American Revolution, which won an award for the best book of legal scholarship published in that year. The book, that book, looked at the profound influence of Cesare Beccaria, and who anyone who's studied anything about criminology knows has had a huge influence in this country as well as elsewhere. We're so glad that you're here. And I want to know what the MFA studies were. So that was part of your experience. Lou Jones is a globally known photographer and teacher of photography. I asked, which of the 2 states have you not been working in? Because Lou Jones has worked in 48 of the US states and 61 countries, and his photography has taken people into worlds including guerrilla camps in the Central America, the Winter and Summer Olympics, a tall ship in the Atlantic Ocean, and most highly relevant for us here today, 14 death rows in the United States, which most of us have never seen. So that is just vital, vital work. And the numbers of assistants and people that you've mentored, students and interns, are too many to count. And currently, Lou Jones' studio is documenting the entire continent of Africa, country by country. That is a remarkable undertaking. Antonio Martorell, who by the wonders of modern technology will be able to join us digitally, was born in Puerto Rico, and his workshop is in La Playa de Ponce, and he's been artist in residence for more than 30 years at the University of Puerto Rico, where his painting and drawing and installations, performance arts, TV, radio, his television series that has won 5 Emmy Awards, his work is collected in museums around the world. He is also an extraordinary artist, and we are so very, very grateful to have each of you here today. And we're going to go alphabetically. So, John, what takes you to this subject? How does your work reflect on the death penalty?
Right. Well, I actually grew up in Mankato, Minnesota, which was the site of the largest mass hanging in U.S. history. You may know that during the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln was faced with some death sentences that came out of the U.S.-Dakota War. Over 300 people were sentenced to death. Ultimately, 38 people were executed at the same time in my hometown. One person we know by mistake, Chaska. And so I grew up kind of thinking about the death penalty. And then as I got into law school, I took a death penalty seminar and then just started writing about it, working on some cases. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about the death penalty with my work is I've began the death penalty looking at what was absent. So we're thinking about images today and how, the exhibit, which I just had a chance to see, which is a really fabulous exhibit, looking at spectacle, shame, and sympathy. These were things that actually Walt Whitman thought about a lot when he was actually writing against the death penalty as a journalist in Brooklyn. But the idea of the death penalty is something I've been thinking about for 3 decades, and punishments, other punishments as well. The pillory, whipping, which was not actually in the latter case, Justice Blackmun, when he was on the Eighth Circuit, declared lashing within prisons unconstitutional in violation of the Eighth Amendment. And my first book was called Death in the Dark, was looking at how executions came to be in the private sphere and away from that public spectacle that the exhibit talks about. And also how executions moved from the daytime into the night. And so from the 1830s to the 1930s, about 100 years, executions moved into the private sphere. And we also see around starting about the 1880s, executions start moving into the dark. And there was laws that were passed that required execution to be conducted before the hour of sunrise. And at the same time, many of those laws actually said that newspapers could not print any of the details of the executions. Actually had gag laws. There was actually some newspapers in St. Paul that were prosecuted under that law, were fined like $25 each for printing the details, which actually ended up leading to the abolition of the death penalty in Minnesota in 1911, where I'm from. And so photographs, images have great power, but there's also, I think, things that are unseen, and that's what I'd like to talk about a little bit today, what was unseen. And one of the things that I've been thinking about recently is psychological torture. And if you think about what the death penalty really is, the death penalty really is just a series of death threats. A capital charging decision is a death threat. A sentence of death that's imposed is just a more credible death threat. And ultimately, as you move up to the actual execution, you just have the threat become more and more imminent. And a mock execution, a simulated execution, is already considered to be the classic example of psychological torture. So if a fake execution is torture, one would have to ask yourself, what about a real one? So psychological torture is something you don't see, it's hidden, but nonetheless it's still there, and actually it's a violation of international law. And so I see the death penalty really as a battle about whether or not we will actually have universal human rights. In the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, Eleanor Roosevelt actually convinced she was in charge of the drafting committee, convinced the people on the committee not to put in a reference to the death penalty, something, again, absent from the Universal Declaration, because she saw that there was a movement afoot in the states to abolish the death penalty. And I think that if we really commit ourselves to the idea of universal rights, we have to protect not just the innocent, also the guilty from being tortured, being subjected to cruel, inhuman, degrading treatment or punishment. And for me, that's what this battle about the abolition of the death penalty is all about, is ensuring we actually have universal human rights. So as we think about the images you're going to see, and there's some really powerful images, I've got a chance to preview them. I also want you to think about what's absent. We have a bar on TV cameras in execution chambers. They've not allowed people to photograph at actual executions. And we also have the hiddenness of the psychological torture that is going on. And right now, actually, in death penalty states, like in Alabama, they define psychological torture as in the criminal law context as making someone aware of their impending death and then the person being helpless to prevent that death. And that's exactly what we have on steroids when we think about death row, but the people on death row have been treated always differently than everybody else. But if you really want to commit yourself to universal human rights, then you have to apply it across the board. The rule of law demands no less.
Thank you so much. I have been reading a lot about lynching myself in this country and the history of lynching as a spectacle with postcards sold. It seems to me very bound up with the practice of the death penalty here. The big difference being that was extra legal, but it's all part and parcel of violence as a response to all kinds of fears. So, Lou Jones, we are just so honored that you're here. Can you tell us what brought you at first to the work on the death penalty and what your searing images of death row tell us?
Well, I'm coming at this, I think, in a very different place. I think I've been able to trace my association with the death penalty back. I mean, it's vague. I was very young. I had an argument with my father. We were watching TV. I'm from Washington, D.C. We were watching TV, and my father watched the news constantly. And at the end of one of the news broadcasts, the announcer said, so-and-so was executed at 1 minute after midnight.
Was the time.
In Maryland. And my father went, he got what he deserved. And at that time, I thought my father walked on water. He was never wrong. I adored him. And I went, wait a minute. That ain't right. And he and I got into an argument over the issue. And for the first time in my life, I realized my father could be wrong. 20 years later, maybe not quite 20 years later, as an artist, I'm a commercial photographer. I have a wonderful, one of my assistants is here in the audience, actually. I was looking for a non-commercial project, and over probably a year rejected many ideas, and somehow remembered. I was actually in a hotel room in Kyoto, Japan, and remembered this argument I had with my father over this issue of the death penalty. And I realized that I, as a photographer, had to sort of use the universal. I'm not political. I don't have an academic, I had to try to use my photography, which I consider the universal language, to show people. And I wasn't coming from it from an academic or a legal point of view. I was coming at it from an emotional one. What would possess someone to kill somebody else? How can I maybe change or at least address that narrative? So as a photographer, is there any way we can sort of show some of the pictures? Is that possible? Mm-hmm. Is there, they're up, okay. So I photographed on 14 different death rows. And I've got to tell you that this is impossible. Now, everybody doesn't believe me, but in point of fact, we've been approached by network news, newspapers, New York Times, Life magazine. We've been approached by everybody. They could care less about me or my project. All they wanted to know was, how did I get in? So 27 people, and we see there's a woman here. Actually, these are two very unique photographs. This is one of the very few women. You can probably tell me better about the statistics on how many women have been given the death penalty. So this was a woman in Kentucky, and was accused and convicted of, I believe, killing 5 people within a 2 or 3 day spree. And we were able to smuggle in a photograph. And you have to understand, getting into death row, getting in there, and we photographed all 27, what they call contact visits. That means I was in the room, I could touch them, not some screen between us, glass, as the movies, they always show you between some chain link fence between the two of you, all 27 people. So she, having serviced a lot of men over her life, decided she wanted to get pretty for the photograph. So another prisoner did her hair. Her lawyer brought in some clothes for her. She had different vitamins, because they couldn't use cosmetics, so she has vitamins that she was able to use as eyeliner and lipstick and things like that. But we smuggled this photograph, and the idea being, which is one of the things presence about visual, is that everybody, even people on death row, everybody was somebody's child at one point. So how do we, then this fellow, Nick Yaris, is, after 21 years on death row, he got off because of DNA. So he's walking around. The last time I communicated with him was in California. And, but he was able to, this is in Pennsylvania. This is it. Next, is there a way? Yes. Some of you may be old enough to remember Mumia Abu Jamal, who probably at one point was the most well-known person on death row. He had an incredible system of people who followed him. He's no longer on death row. He's actually somehow been able to commute his sentence so that he's no longer on death row. But he's had songs written about him, rap music and things like that. But this was in Pennsylvania, and we tried to be very, very careful, even though we had to take whatever came our way, because we got refused by so many. We wrote hundreds. I have 2 file cabinets full of the letters that I wrote between us and the rejection. And so we tried to be very, very careful so that we were able to cover all the different categories of people on, young, old, black, white, male, female. This gentleman is Lester Kills on Top. And he and his brother were both on death row. I was able to photograph both of them. Kills on Top, they were Native Americans. And so I only can assume that that was a translation of his Indian name. But so we were able to very meticulously take and cover all the different categories, at least most of them. And I think there's one more. Is there one more? Or is that just, okay, that's it, okay. So the idea being that it produced several exhibitions. We're in exhibit right here at Harvard. It produced 2 books, and I have been in touch with, so far, this is sensationalism that this subject just engenders from social media, from the regular media, is that I believe we've suffered through 13 executions. And as I said, Nick Yaris is walking free, and I would say probably 4 or 5 are no longer on death row. They all have, do you remember, Francesca? Do you remember the numbers? Okay, I think it's 4 or 5 are no longer on death row. They've their sentence has been commuted for legal reasons or political reasons or something else, but they're still in prison. But one is actually walking free. So my commitment to your question is, it sort of came about in a dream, as a lot of my projects come about. It's just that the subject matter was so profound and it damaged me for years. I had nightmares for years going in. I actually went to one execution. He invited me to come in, and I said, no, absolutely. This is not what this is about. I have no desire to see anyone killed. That's what the whole project's about, is the abolition of the death penalty. And, but I was committed and I went, and so, and we can talk about that later. And that's okay?
Thank you so much. And the title here is Exposure, which is
Final Exposure.
Final Exposure, which is a perfect title. Antonio, can I call on Antonio? Are you there?
Yes, I am.
Wonderful.
I'm moved with what I just heard. I'm sorry I didn't see it, but I'll be sure to see it sometime.
Well, if you are able, we would love to hear what drew you to this topic and how do you reflect on it?
Yes, well, that's the video. It's in there.
Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light.
I was in my teens when I first heard those death-defying words, which transmitted the larger-than-life booming voice of the poet Dylan Thomas. I never conceived that those verses would echo within me in such subversive ways. In my understanding, they masquerade precepts of law sanctioning state murder. As a child, I had watched the movie A Tale of Two Cities, mesmerized by the silvery glow of the guillotine blade falling with a thud amidst the thunderous roar of the celebrating crowd's lust for blood. My sentimental education came alive in movie theaters, watching film noir with its black, white, and shimmering gray on the big screen, myself engulfed in darkness. I was entranced at the sight of Montgomery Clift being led to the electric chair, leaving behind a teary-eyed Elizabeth Taylor in a place in the sun. Then again, I remember coming back home after school only to find there was no such thing as a free lunch or a home. My mother, elder sister, and baby brother was squatting on the sidewalk, surrounded by her belongings under the noonday sun. All the household goods piled up on the pavement after being evicted from our house. The memory of losing our domestic world became a death of sorts. Many years later, as a young adult, I had first-hand experience of a federal court system in my native Puerto Rico. Although our constitutional law does not contemplate the death penalty yet, our island, one of the last remaining colonies in the world, federal law is enforced beyond and above our own. So far, capital punishment has never been imposed by a Puerto Rican jury in federal court. I am quite familiar with the federal system since I have served in that court as an interpreter, as a juror, and as a newspaper reporter. In 1989, I covered the criminal trial of independent leader Filiberto Ojeda Rios, who was acquitted in San Juan. 15 years later, Filiberto was corralled in his home and killed by the FBI. In the end, the death sentence had been applied by federal police, absent the hindrance of due process of law. I studied international law at the School of Foreign Service in Georgetown University long before becoming an artist, believing I could, as a diplomat, bring peace to the world, only to learn about the nature of power politics and the fact that I had no country to represent, as I was born in a non-sovereign state. I don't recall when I was first exposed to Goya's Prince, his masterful depiction of human cruelty, mockery of justice and religion, and the ravages of war. But it all came together when I was invited to participate in an international congress against the death penalty. The print portfolio showcased here was my contribution. Goya's title page for the Caprichos became the guiding light for the display of capital punishment's furnishings. This portfolio sums it all up. The loss of my first home, film noir, imperial conquest and colonialism, civil strife, race and class hatred, religious and gender atrocities, and the bombings and mass shootings that have fed my work. It is the nature of art, as Goya masterfully shows, to dress up savagery in such a fashion as to seduce the spectator into becoming a witness, to look and render testimony of humankind's inhumanity in the hope to make us better people. The death penalty is being imposed on all of us, raging not only in the course of law, but through the destruction of the environment and the plunder of our natural resources, by the willful disregard of life in favor of profit, and the continuation of slavery with invisible chains but evident brutality. Maybe this is why I crafted this funereal menagerie, attempting to depict those raging scaffolds of death that confuse law and order with justice. A society organized around a punitive system cannot solve basic human problems of our own creation. There are better means. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so very much. I'm going to ask each of you one further question before we invite anybody here to also make a comment or a question. And the further question is, we have a discussion of silence, we have an exploration of closed places that people are not allowed to see, and here we have an invocation of invisible chains. What is it that art can do, along with law and politics, in affecting public understanding of something like the death penalty?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very powerful. I was actually just at Minneapolis Institute of Arts. The current Uffizi director has a relationship, used to be the work at the Minneapolis Institute of Arts, and brought a Botticelli exhibit to Minneapolis, which was the first time a lot of these things have left the country. But that was an amazing exhibit. There's a image there, a painting of somebody being whipped basically to the gallows. But there was also upstairs, there was an exhibit of a Vietnamese American artist, Tio Nguyen. And Tio Nguyen grew up in Vietnam and then immigrated to the United States, lives in Minnesota. Came when he was 16. And of course, so much of what people think about when they think about Vietnam is the war. So what Tio Nguyen did was actually take famous photographs of Vietnam, including the young girl running on the road who's naked, who's just been subjected to a napalm attack. There's fallen soldiers, there's helicopters, and he's taken those parts of the images out to show the beauty of Vietnam. Which is very interesting. So you have a grassland with just serene, but from the same images that were, and so I think if we envision the absence of the death penalty, which again, in Europe, we already have a death penalty-free Europe. We have 90 countries have now signed on to the second optional protocol of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, that we can actually envision a world without the death penalty, without these images of cruelty in it. And again, I think part of the reason that it's sometimes so hard to get people interested in the death penalty because we no longer have that visceral response like people did in the 17th century, 18th century that drew people into what was called the anti-gallows movement at that point in time. And so some of these images I think are very powerful, especially when you know that some of these people have been released from death row for innocence. There was a guy named Kirk Bloodsworth. There's a series of videos. It's called 1 for 10, and it's a documentary maker, but Kirk is featured. He was convicted of a rape and murder of a young girl in Maryland, was later exonerated through DNA evidence, and he describes in there how he could stand in his cell and lean back just a few inches and touch both walls. And so I think these kind of images will draw people in to the movement, maybe not in the same visceral way that we had in the past with actually people, the revulsion that people felt to executions, but I think nonetheless we've seen the numbers of people being executed in the United States go down, and these kind of images I think are really powerful to help us get to the final conclusion of the abolition of the death penalty.
Thank you. Lou, do you have a thought?
Well, I only had my art, at least that's what I thought. I've stood in lots and lots of protest lines and things like that, but I wanted to use something that was a little bit more direct in what I did well, and that was to use photography to see if I could change the narrative. Now, it was total hubris, you know. I don't think I've changed one mind in the world about it, but but at least in my youth, when I did this originally, thinking that photography had the ability to at least ask the questions. I think that it was Robert Kennedy that said that, I'm going to paraphrase because I don't remember the quote, but he said something about, you know, politics and religion and all of these things deal with our major issues, but art is the conscience of a society. And so artists are able to go out in a free society, as we claim we have, and bring up and ask the questions. And that's where I see my role. Not so much solving the problem of jurisprudence, but asking a lot of questions. Because of a number of other exhibits that I had hung before the death penalty project, I was seeing how people were reacting to many of the portraits, literally, almost viscerally. And I said, what if I put nobody in this room has been in face to face with somebody on death row. But I can try to come as close to that as possible. And if you can walk up and look them in the eye, that was, again, hubris on my part, but look them in the eye and still pull the switch, it was a different narrative. And that was what my whole idea, ask the questions.
Oh, very, very powerful, and behind the very locked walls. And Antonio, what is your sense about what art can offer? You gave us in that exquisite video so many images across particularly Western society, literature and so forth, where the death penalty figures and confronted us with the enduring layering of those images. What do you think art can offer?
Well, art, as in any other endeavor, can show light into horror. And just listening to you all, I go back and think that even now, the reason why I'm not there personally is because right now I have COVID, but still I can sit in a comfortable armchair in front of the television set and see trials of murder go through and punishment being accorded by juries or judges, and see how death as spectacle and punishment as entertainment is becoming even more frequent because it comes right to your bedroom and you can watch it while you relax and sip your coffee. And I think it's horrible. I've been close to the federal court system, as I have shown, and I've seen it up close, and it made me really be repugnant to it and see how it grows instead of diminishing. I learned in order to do my portfolio on pena, penita, pena, funereal furniture, I did some research and learned that in some states you can choose the way they kill you, which is supposed to be something very humane. You can choose going to the electric chair, having a mortal injection, or be shot to death. And I think it's a horrible sense of humor that comes out of that, and it's inhuman. And myself, as a half citizen in a colonial territory of the United States, knowing that we cannot even determine the way we punish our crimes, because the death penalty can and is imposed by federal law in our country. It hasn't been done because no Puerto Rican jury has ever allowed it to be. But as I have shown, they carry it on off the court in the darkness of illegality, but state-sponsored crime. So it's amazing to me that with all this fundamental religious revival in the United States of so-called Christian values, you go into the darkest depth of those values, which are actually a negation of them, by having legal murder committed. I think it's repugnant to everyone, and certainly in a country such as mine, which does not govern itself. I really congratulate the Harvard University Law Library in getting this group of artists and art and law scholars together to trying to bring light into this darkness. Because I never thought that those words, those verses I heard that fabulous poet Dylan Thomas so early in my life would come back to me and really provoke these thoughts and these images. I'm so grateful for that opportunity and to be able to speak to you here, even from so far down here in Puerto Rico. But thank you so much for your kind attention.
Thank you, especially for making the effort as while you have COVID and the wonders of modern technology that you are here. I am very struck by how all three of you are really bearing witness to a practice that Antonio rightly describes as state violence, state crime. I had the privilege of working for Justice Thurgood Marshall, who had opposed the death penalty as a practicing lawyer, and then while being on the Supreme Court, he dissented in every single case that approved the death penalty, and it was the only area of law in which he said, I do not adhere to the precedents. I understand the practice is if you lose, you're supposed to fall in line. He says, I cannot do that. And what I learned from him is it doesn't matter whether you think in the abstract, in some other society, that the death penalty is unacceptable. In our society, it is so often erroneously imposed. With the examples that Lou Jones gave us of people whose cases were, whether DNA or later exposed to be just faulty, and also with the racial disparity and the way in which it's meted out. Over and over again, studies show that it's not the race of the perpetrator, it's the race of the victim that explains the disparities that are dramatic in the enactment of the death penalty in this country. And Justice Powell, when presented with that evidence, what was his response? He said, but if that's true, then what you might show us disparities on the basis of gender or disparities on some other races, and then what do we do? And somehow the claim of too much justice was a reason not to do justice. Well, one comment that I just want to make as I open it up to you all is that I think that the issue of desensitization is now before us, and I'm very grateful, Antonio, that you raised it, that because of the modern media, people see simulated death a lot, but not real death very much, and not state-imposed death. And how does that put out of whack our moral responses, our emotional responses? I think that that is a very serious problem, and how can art, law, advocacy, education, reawaken people and people's conscience and experiences and responses while we're being flooded with these images? I think that's a very important question. I do open it up, and who has a comment? And please introduce yourself.
I'm Julia Salova.
Hold on one sec, the mic is coming to you.
Hi. Oh. Okay, cool. Hi, everyone. I'm Julia Salofsky. I'm just visiting from the University of Baltimore. Professor Bessler is my professor. I actually have a little bit of a complicated question, but I want to start it off with just this. I have a BFA in sculpture and MFA in curatorial practice, and I applied to curatorial practice with the intent of going to law school because I believe law and art need to both deprofessionalize and decentralize. But I have a real question here is, in a legal setting, I often hear that question, what does art have to offer? And so I'll read you this statement about my own experience as an artist who has, I'm autistic and I have a special interest in law. So law has played a role in all of my art. And to be honest, what does law have to offer me? I walked into University of Baltimore and my professors told me my art experience doesn't matter, yet my art experience is what landed a lawsuit in the Richmond City jails where we were able to actually get justice for over 40 inmates. When the lawyers were telling me it wasn't possible, I read the law and I finessed it due to my creative thought. Nuria Guel in Spain used contract law and property law to literally prevent evictions from happening. So what I want to ask the panelists today, because I feel like we're constantly centering this thing about like what's art's place in the law. Well, I want to know what's law's place, because the reality is artists are protecting you, artists are coming up with solutions, but what is law's place? Because every time that art sheds light, it's the law school buildings that close the doors and don't continue to open their eyes. And that's more of the problem for me.
Thank you. Who would like to respond to that?
Well, I mean, I think the law has a very important role to play. I mean, law and politics go together. And so when you, as a lawyer, I think you're duty bound as a lawyer, as a member of the profession, to work for change when you see something wrong in the legal system. That's what I've been trying to do with respect to the death penalty. Obviously, a lot of images move people to action. And I think that's important. We take that information in, we respond to it. I mean, one of the things that was just mentioned earlier about what we were talking about Puerto Rico, the idea of death qualifying jurors. We death qualify juries, so we only put people on the jury who would be willing to impose the death penalty, which seems to me to be very crazy, right? You're stacking the deck against at the penalty phase of the case, and right now the current Supreme Court actually has they require, when you're challenging a method of execution, they require the lawyer who's representing a death row inmate to propose a method by which their own client could be put to death, essentially stipulating that if you just did it this way, it would be okay. I think that really turns the adversarial system completely on its head. And it forces us as lawyers, as a member of the profession, to respond to that. And I think that the physicians have already moved away from the death penalty. But the lawyers need to take in all this information, all the stimulus that they're getting. You've talked about the problem of desensitization. I do think it's a huge problem. You know, people, by the time you finish high school, I think it's like tens of thousands of times you've seen simulated murders on television. But people do respond differently to real videos. We saw that with George Floyd's murder, right? We saw that in Memphis. So if images have the power to move us as lawyers to respond to change, I think we have the obligation to engage in that law reform.
I don't want to defend law but nor do I want to condemn law. Law is just a vehicle. It's just a set of tools, and it can be used for terrible purposes or it can be used for good. And the question is how to use it for good, it seems to me. And I think that integrating art much more throughout professional education, as again medical schools have done, is a way to remind people about their whole humanity and to remind people, as photographs do, of the human beings who are on the other side of the legal system. So thank you for that comment. Anybody else have a comment, question? We have one back there, Jocelyn. Thank you. And please just identify yourself.
I'd like to ask the panelists what they think the chances are of our ever getting federal legislation providing that in a federal trial in a state that does not have capital punishment, the court cannot impose the death penalty. I'm thinking of the Tsarnaev case, where that's the marathon bomber case, where he was indicted both in Suffolk County and out of the United States District Court in Boston. And in deciding which jurisdiction would try him, the district attorney, to his everlasting shame, in my view, conceded the county could have tried him much quicker than the feds. The feds, it's much longer wait before you get to a trial. Suffolk County could have tried him. We do not have the death penalty in Massachusetts, but the district attorney intentionally dismissed the state indictment so that the feds could try him and impose the death penalty. I'm not a complete states' rightist, but I have to say that in this instance, I thought twice about the whole issue of states' rights versus federal rights, and I thought that in Massachusetts, we had a right to try Tsarnaev and to impose a life sentence, rather than have the feds usurp the opportunity to, and he's still not, by the way, of course. The death penalty litigation goes on probably as long as the natural life of the defendant.
Thank you for that, and he's a young man, too. I think we are supposed to end in just a few minutes, so I'm just wondering if we can take the last question right up here, Jocelyn, and then we can have just closing thoughts.
Yes, please.
So first to the gentleman in the back, even if Massachusetts had moved against him, the feds could still do it because there's no double jeopardy rule when there are two sovereignties. But I want to comment a bit about art, because for every Memphis or George Floyd, there are hundreds of images of grisly murders. And so the balance of imagery is not helpful to your abolition in the slightest. So I wonder, Goya, the reason Goya is so powerful is because there's a bite. There's a kind of irony and ridicule built into it. And I wonder if to the extent they can, artists have to perhaps, because this is a political matter ultimately, they have to play the ridicule or the irony card.
Thank you, thank you. So closing thoughts in relationship to what we've heard or whatever this has prompted for you. Lou, do you have a thought?
Again, I talk about the hubris that my youth thought that my photographs could make a difference. But people, and I will answer this lady over here, not answer, but I will at least respond to her about how people ask me often whether or not I was changed by the project. And you know, I took it on knowing full well that it would probably cause a lot of damage to me, which it did, but I took it on anyway. But found that I thought it was something that was necessary for me to address in general and see that if something could happen. The change came in that I was brought up in America thinking that we were doing mostly the right thing in most of the things we were, you know, that's how they educate us in schools and stuff. And found that, to this lady, that our legal system, especially when we dealt with the death penalty, was failing us. That it was political. This is all things that I, you know, completely changing me around by photographing and talking to these people. It was political. It was a thing that the states, the federal system, all of us were using purely as revenge in reacting to people like that. And it was directed, as you both brought up, towards people that didn't have the means to defend themselves, whether it be financial, which is often brought up, but racial, how few women are on death row. All of these issues are very political, and so the system just has not addressed it well enough. People constantly brought to me, hey, you're taking and deifying these people by photographing them. You're making heroes of these people. You're making them human. And I said, no, you know, they're the only ones left after these acts. I want to find out what caused them. And so my final comments are that it had that. And I got this from Sister Helen Prejean. John and I were talking about Sister Helen. This is almost a direct quote. She said, why would I give the federal system the right of life and death when I wouldn't give them the right to collecting my own garbage?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we need to reframe the debate on the death penalty, because when I was growing up, it was all about, well, does it deter crime or not? That was as if the answer would provide the oracle to the whole, you know, riddle of the death penalty. And if you look at it through a human rights lens, ordinarily we prohibit death threats. They are criminal acts, and yet we're allowing our legal system to make use of death threats on a regular, systematic basis. And so we need to be thinking about the idea of what we're doing. And of course, official torture is about what official actors are doing. If you look at that opinion I mentioned from Justice Blackmun, who was then a circuit judge, the Jackson versus Bishop case, he talks about how lashing is both degrading to the person being punished, but also to the person that's punishing. And so I think in the same way that we should not allow ourselves to use kind of torturous practices in inflicting punishment. And remember, in the European legal system, the continental Europe, official torture was part and parcel of the criminal justice system. Judges were authorizing people to be tortured. And I think that if we think about the death penalty as death threats, that will refocus the debate about the death penalty and force the people that are inflicting the death penalty to confront exactly what they are doing in the process of carrying out this punishment of death.
It's very powerful, and how to arrest our normal going about our daily lives and just stop and rethink and reframe. We've come to the end. I'm sorry, Antonio, not to turn to you again, but Jocelyn, it's an honor to take part in this. I think that the subtitle of the year-long exhibit at the library is exactly where we need to end, which is the subtitle is Spectacle, Shame, and Sympathy. And I can't imagine a better discussion than we've had on exactly those themes.
Thank you, Martha, John, Lou, and Antonio. I think art forces us to pause and reflect in a way that other images or other things we read don't necessarily. So I really so enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much. Our next event is a fireside chat, 50 years after Furman, the death penalty in America, which will be moderated by Professor Carol Steiker and feature a panel of capital punishment experts. So I invite you to participate in that on Wednesday, March 22nd in this room, same time, same place. And our final event, which I'm really excited about as well, will be an HLS Library Student Ideas Salon where students from the law school's capital punishment clinic will discuss their experiences. And that event will be held Monday, April 3rd at 4 in the library. So I hope you'll join us for those additional events. Please join me in thanking our panelists. Antonio, thank you for joining us from Puerto Rico. It was lovely to see you all. Thank you.